Hello and welcome. I'm Penny Thornton and I'm talking astrology. On this particular video, I'm going to be talking about the solar eclipse in Libra on the 2nd of October 2024 at 10 degrees 4 minutes of Libra. Now, lots of things to consider, not just the solar eclipse, but it's placing in amongst the other things that are going on at the time, and also the kind of resonances it has with this time last year when there was another solar eclipse in Libra. Not on this exact same degree, but there's clearly a resonance factor between these two periods of time, which I'm going to be talking about as well. I'm not going to be doing sign by sign on this particular video. I'm going to save that for the next full moon video, full moon in Aries. But still, I think there's a lot for you to take in just generally, even if I'm not completely addressing your sign. So the first thing I want to talk about is the kind of eclipse it is. It's called an annular eclipse, which means that the moon isn't entirely covering the sun as it would do with a total solar eclipse, only about 93% of it. So what we end up with is this wonderful ring of fire. And when we look at these eclipses, well, they're rather marvelous things. I have to say you won't be able to see this effect unless you live in the South Americas. We're talking about Chile, we're talking about South Argentina, the Pacific, around that area. And actually, the best place of all to see this solar eclipse is Easter Island. And I'm going to be talking about why that might be even more significant in terms of the interpretation of what's going on at the moment. The other thing to say about this eclipse is that it's quite a long eclipse. Sometimes an eclipse will take 3 or 4 minutes and it's done, but this one is going to be over 7 minutes long. So it's considered rather important in terms of the effect that the way it looks, let's put it that way. But in my experience, I don't think the length of time an eclipse takes to, be at its complete point, passing over, is really a kind of guide to its general importance. Eclipses are eclipses are eclipses. They all pack a powerful punch, and whether they're close to Earth, so that the moon, for instance, in a lunar eclipse appears very large. In fact, as the one just recently, 2 weeks ago, was rather a spectacular one because the moon was so close to the Earth. But, don't assume that because of its astronomical effect, it means that it's more important than any other one. No, it's not. They're all important. And as I often say, they're game changers, whether it's in our own lives, when an eclipse will connect with something in our natal charts, or whether we're thinking about history. And I have to say, this period of time, we are making history all the time. And these eclipses are having their part to play in the story that is, or the narrative of the times, as I often say. So before I kind of get into it, the other thing I want to say is thank you for all your comments, which I really appreciate. Thanks for subscribing. And of course, if you are new to my channel, please subscribe. Okay, so with no more ado, let's get to it. So this solar eclipse in Libra, do we think the fact that it is in Libra has any kind of shading or any kind of value? Well, it will do. Wherever an eclipse takes place, the nature of that particular sign is going to have an effect. It won't have as much of an effect as to the connections a solar or lunar eclipse is making to other planets or points, or in this case, we're going to be looking at fixed stars. That's much more important in a way. But when we think about Libra, we think about this sign being to do with harmony, to do with peace, to do with love. And if you think about all the Librans, they're usually very charming people. They have a way of presenting themselves to the world and of being in society in a way that's very pleasant. But don't let that fool you, because Libra is a cardinal sign. And as I said in my last video, when I talked about Mars in Cancer being in its fall, it isn't a weak Mars at all. I mean, Cancer is a cardinal sign, just like Libra. So you've got to remember that all Librans are movers and shakers, even if they do it rather like a duck on water. You don't see any of the movement going on underneath the water. Well, that's definitely where it's at. The other thing I think is kind of important about Libra is its place in the zodiac circle, because it's halfway round. And we get this idea with Libra that it's a sign that notes polarities. And what is it trying to do, Libra, but find the halfway position between polarities, trying to unite opposites. And we certainly, I think, can look at that quality influencing this solar eclipse. We already know there are so many divisions in society, divisions in politics. There are so many conflicts in the world. We can see this solar eclipse in Libra is perhaps there to show us that we should try to find unity. We should try to find the halfway point between extremes of any sort. The other thing, which I think is very interesting, is that Libra and its ruling planet Venus, they are often present, either rising Libra, rising Venus, culminating Venus on the midheaven, or important aspects to Venus, often present at the start or the outbreak of a major war. So again, we learn a lot more about Libra from this kind of factor. And perhaps also when we think about what going to war is all about, it's all about getting justice, isn't it? Getting what's rightfully ours, doing what's best for us. So we can see how this Venus principle is working. We also have the nodal axis on the Aries-Libra axis, hence we've got a solar eclipse in Libra. But really, I call this nodal axis the axis of war and peace. And since the year that it has been moving through Aries with its opposite point in Libra, we certainly have been so aware of wars. In fact, as I might refer to shortly, this time last year on the 14th of October, days before that solar eclipse, the Hamas massacre of all those Israelis really, of course, was the beginning of the war that we have ongoing at the moment, and that I suspect with this second solar eclipse in Libra, we are going to see, as you know, as it unfolds, not a de-escalation, which would be nice. I think really rather more a ramping up of what we've got going. And I should say that I'm recording this particular video on the 22nd of September. So in the past, and very much related to the last lunar eclipse at 25 of, if I remember right, it might be 25 or 26 of Pisces, 27 of Pisces, we had that audacious sabotaging of Hezbollah's all the communication systems that happened, which on the one hand, some views thought was ingenious and audacious, and others thought this is a war crime. You're always going to get different opinions, but it certainly has sparked the whole idea that this is now going to draw Iran and Hezbollah into the war in Gaza much more directly. So that's another thing we might want to keep our eyes on when we look at this solar eclipse and its meaning in our lives. I also want to consider the idea that this particular solar eclipse takes place on the descending node. Remember, the ascending node is always the sign the north node is in. So the ascending node at this point in time is Aries, and the descending node is going to be in Libra, hence we've got this eclipse on the descending node, which when we look at it in a horoscope and we talk about it astrologically, we call it the south node, and we associate that with the past. So in a way, your north node, which is this axis of destiny, for want of a better phrase, we're looking at where we're going in life, where it is our destiny to be and do. But of course, where we've come from, the south node, also plays into that. So we get this idea of the past coming back to haunt us with the eclipse on the south node, the past playing into the present. And of course, with the recent lunar eclipse in Pisces, we've got Saturn and Neptune in Pisces. And to my mind, we have seen so much in the world having to do with atonement and accountability and things coming back, chickens coming home to roost. So again, we've got a flavor of that a little bit with this solar eclipse too. The other thing to remember about a solar eclipse is that it has a capacity to reveal what has been hidden. Again, the past coming out. But at the same time, because when we think about how a solar eclipse is, what is its astronomy, so to speak, we see the moon passing in front of the sun. So we get the idea the sun is in shadow, so to speak. So another message being given by this solar eclipse is that what's going on with the events at the time, the things that are actually happening, there will be some aspect of this that is hidden. And so these two things go together, the past revealing itself and also something that we're seeing happening right now has also, we're not seeing all of it. So without further ado, let me get even further into this very important period of 2024. So here we have a picture of this eclipse in terms of what was going on at the time, the horoscope. So I've said it from Washington, not because I'm interested in looking at its effect in terms of America and politics and the situation, but really because it gave us a very nice picture of this eclipse. We can see it right up there, perpendicular to the ascendant, 10 degrees of Libra and 4 minutes, up close and personal to Mercury at 11 degrees. And we could also see there Mars, in this case, on the angle, on the descendant, but we can really see, and what I want to be able to see, is the fact that this solar eclipse and Mercury is square to Mars. Now, what you might also notice when you look at this is that in recent times, and if we look back at the 19th of August and that particular full moon, and also the most recent lunar eclipse, I had drawn a lot of geometric patterns in the center of our circle. And that was showing the really important alignments at the time. There were a couple of kites, there were yods, and obviously T-squares as well. So we've been looking at a very powerful period. And when you get planets in an alignment, like the Grand Trine, like a kite, like a T-square, like a Grand Cross, they're all resonating at the same pitch. And that's why they're powerful, because you might only have one planet at one point of a configuration, but of course it's going to trigger all the others. So you get this huge resonance effect of all the very different influences. Always alignments are said to be both, certainly the Grand Cross and the T-square, we call these angles of tension. We think there's a lot of friction. But as I always say, with friction, you get energy. Think about, rubbing a stick, you get fire, the heat, and we get energy and light from fire. And we need to think about the more difficult configurations, ostensibly, the squares, the T-squares, the Grand Cross, all of those, with a much healthier kind of attitude that they are dynamic, they have an effect, they are energy, they are, they are light, fire. So think about them in that way. And to a certain extent, we get the same thing with kites and yachts. They're all connected. So these planets are all playing into one another and giving us a very intense experience. So we don't have any, particular alignment here except the square of Mars to the solar eclipse and Mercury. That's the main thing that we're actually looking at. I also want to take you through what's happening at the time, because this also, as I said, plays into the effects of something like a solar eclipse. And so these are important dates really for your astrological diary. And we come first to the 9th of October, and we find Jupiter turning stationary retrograde. And if we look at that, we've got Jupiter at the 4 o'clock position at 21:16. Of course, it's not retrograde at the time of the solar eclipse, but it will be a week later. So this is kind of important if you've got Jupiter anywhere significant in your natal chart, or you are a Gemini, a Sagittarius, a Virgo, or a Pisces, because Jupiter is having a big effect on you 4 signs. Jupiter is about growth. And as I often say, there's good growth so that you have progress, you see increase, welcome increase, but also what's going to happen is the problems are going to increase and things that are out of control are going to increase. So in as much as Jupiter is a good guy, it can also cause a lot of trouble by taking us into excess. Now, when a planet is stationary, and we've got Pluto turning stationary direct a couple of days later, it's super powerful. Its properties are much more noticeable. So when we think about Jupiter's presence on our astrological stage at this time, we have got all sorts of potential for things to be enormous. There isn't, if it's going to be an event, it's going to be a big event. And we might think about royalty, which is very Jupiterian. I'm going to talk about that in a minute too. Or we think about celebrity. We think too about guru figures and people who we look up to. So we've got a lot of things surrounding all of that when we've got Jupiter turning direct or retrograde. It also is an opportunity, once a planet is moving retrograde, to go back over old ground. And what sometimes happens when you've got a real Jupiter boost going on in your life is that you've got too far too soon. You've run before you can walk, and you have to catch up. And that's often why something stops or slows down, or you feel that there is a change of direction in something, but in a negative way. Don't be negative about it. It needs that time to come together. Let's think of it that way. 3 days later, we've got Pluto turning stationary direct. Now, of course, I often use this analogy of a big ship, a huge, massive ship at sea. If it wants to turn around, it doesn't just turn around on a sixpence. It has to go 20, 30 miles in diameter to turn around. It can take hours. And it's really the same with a slower moving planet like Pluto. It's stationary. It doesn't just turn direct at a particular time. It's in the process of doing so for a while. It's pretty well static. So that again makes Pluto very, very powerful. And what do we know about what's going on with Pluto? Well, for a start, it's at 29 degrees of Capricorn, as you can see here in the chart, and in the sort of 9 o'clock position there. 29 degrees is a very significant degree. It's known as the anaretic degree, and it's a degree of crisis. And if you've got anything at 29 degrees in your horoscope, then that planet is going to be super strong, and you'll want to watch all the transits and progressions to it because it's much more meaningful for you. And if we think about what's been going on with Pluto since 2007, Pluto has been making its way through Capricorn. Yes, it's crossed over the boundary into Aquarius a couple of times and then got slunk back into Capricorn. But as soon as it turns direct on the 12th of October, it's making its way forward into Aquarius, and it's not coming back for another 240 years, so certainly beyond our lifetimes. So what tends to happen on the anaretic degree, or the last degree of a sign, is that all sorts of things that have been associated with Pluto's transit join the things that have happened in Capricorn. And when you think of its legacy it's left us, we had that major financial collapse of all those subprime mortgages, and how many other countries went into recession because of that, and how our ability to, recession was something that affected us all to one degree or another. So that is a big signature on the Pluto in Capricorn era. And we've also seen a lot of big structures collapsing. Sometimes quite physically, we've seen a lot of land slips and earthquakes, or things like this that have happened. And we can look at that literally. But we also want to think about, just even in a small way, the idea of how many big companies are downsizing, how many big companies have gone out of business. And what we're seeing right now in terms of politics and governments is this period of such division, and we're seeing the rise of the far right and maybe the rise of the far left as well. We've gone into extremes, and we know that Pluto is a planet of extremes. So we're seeing the evidence of this increasingly at this time. We look back at this particular year when the far right, particularly in France, has really threatened the whole status quo of the country. And just recently with Germany, who feared that the far right party might get in by a kind of hair. They didn't, but they still gained ground. And in Britain, we saw the party of the left getting in power by a landslide majority. So it is not just the far right, it's the far left, it's extremes of any sort. And in keeping with the solar eclipse, there is the idea of trying to find the midway point between these extremes. And perhaps we're becoming more aware of extremes around this time as we look at what's going on in the world. The other thing I wanted to talk about in regard to this idea of Pluto in Capricorn coming into Aquarius, if you think about two great oceans, all that weight of water, all that power, all that depth coming together, at that point, imagine what the strait between them is like. Well, it's certainly not a piece of cake, is it? It's very turbulent. And we can use that analogy and think about why we are living in such turbulent times. Pluto having such an influence on generations, on the shaping of nations, really a big player in humanity's story. And we can see why this is such a stormy period. Now, as we look at this, I talked about Jupiter's change of direction affecting the mutable signs, Gemini, Sagittarius, Pisces, and Virgo. When we come to Pluto's direct motion, we're looking at those of you born at the end of Capricorn, Cancer, Aries, and Taurus, but also those of you born at the very beginning of the fixed signs, which is Aquarius, Leo, Taurus, and Scorpio. So you are supremely affected by Pluto's movements, so to speak. And what we have within hours of Pluto turning stationary direct, we've got Mercury squaring Pluto. The principles of Mercury, movement, discussion, debate, we have a lot to do with education with Mercury, with journalism, with messages being given. quite often when I'm looking at charts and I'm looking at an event, I say something like the message, this event was sending a powerful message. And we are going to find that we are going to be able to say that with the events at this time because of Mercury's involvement with Pluto. Events are sending a powerful message. And that's maybe something we can relate to or will relate to in our personal lives every bit as much as we will see it out on the world stage. And of course, the Mercury-Pluto angles also bring up stuff that's hidden, which is why we get a lot of scandals breaking out on a Pluto aspect, or we get things that have been hidden coming to light. And remember, that's just as much of a theme of this particular solar eclipse. We're getting a double whammy here. The very next day, Mars, which we could see in this chart, is squaring the solar eclipse, and Mercury has now reached exactitude to the Sun. So the Sun is squaring Mars, while at the same time, Venus is opposing Uranus. So this constellation really of big, powerful influences is really going to shake things up. And we've already got every ingredient we need, whether we're looking at the political situation in different countries, Venezuela, Sri Lanka, America, everywhere. There are big political moves going on. So this is a time of, well, diversity on the one hand, which is good. We like to think there's diversity going on, but there's also this idea of division going on at this time. And perhaps with the effects of Mars and Uranus and Pluto all coming into that melting pot, we've got a lot of protests, we've got a lot of upsets, we've got a lot of anger, and we've got a lot of violence. So those are themes we're working through here. But we've got to remember that at the same time as I'm using all these words that we don't like very much, that sometimes things have to be like that before we can get to where we need to get. And again, looking at that principle of Venus and Libra going to war for justice. And that may be a very strong theme we can see taking place at this particular time, this particular period of October. It may be ringing particularly loud. Now, there are other things that I want to point to in this chart, which are really rather interesting. Remember, I said a minute or two ago, I talked about fixed stars, and we really saw the importance of fixed stars when we think about Algol, 25 degrees of Taurus. And if you remember, in the middle of the year, around the time of the Republican convention, we saw that Uranus was on Donald Trump's midheaven, aligned with Algol. Algol being a very nasty, has a nasty reputation, Algol. Has to do with people losing their heads. And you can use that as a metaphor for someone, falling off their perch, which is where I chose to use it. But of course, at that particular time, we saw the first assassination attempt on Donald Trump's life. So Algol certainly played into the story of that particular period of time. So now we have two other planets playing into this solar eclipse. We have the fixed star Vindematrix. And, that's a difficult word. I had to practice it, I have to say. It means the harvest, the harvesting of the wine, believe it or not. But it's also got a little epithet, which is the Widowmaker, this particular fixed star. It's again got a very, very bad reputation. It has to do with falsity, with disgrace, with witch hunts. And so when we think about that particular set of adjectives, we think about the times that we're living in, all the conspiracy theories, the lies being spouted to us, and also How often does that word witch hunt come up? Well, it's going to come up long and loud over this solar eclipse. But there is another point at which we should really notice another fixed star, and that's Al-Janib, which is at 9 degrees of Aries. So it's the opposite point to this solar eclipse. Now, this fixed star has the nature of Mars and Mercury. It's again an unfortunate fixed star. It has to do with ambition and bad ideas. So we've got quite a lot of information from the proximity of this solar eclipse with these particular fixed stars. We know that that's going to be part of the story. What we can also look at here is when we look at the solar eclipse and we think about 10 degrees of Libra, is that anywhere on a nation's chart that might be significant? And what do we come up with? We come up with Israel. Israel's Neptune is 10 degrees of Libra. And guess what? Hezbollah's Mars is 10 degrees Aries at the opposite point. And Iran's Sun is 11 degrees of Aries, where that opposite point again. And we've got these three actors involved right now in what's happening in the Middle East. And we have to know that it's all going to be going off at this particular time. That's what this solar eclipse is all about. But coming back to me for a minute, because there's another very interesting aspect to this solar eclipse. And you know, I don't use the asteroids. I'm not interested in the asteroids, largely because I'm a bit of a purist, or some might say I'm a dinosaur. I prefer to use just the planets in the solar system. They're our family. We talk to them, we have a dialogue with them, whereas anything outside the solar system is a little bit speculative to my mind. I do include Chiron now, and that is not only because I had a bit of a moment and I realized how important this planetary archetype was. And of course, it comes into our solar system as a kind of visitor, comes in through Saturn, goes out through Uranus. So it has a Saturn-Uranus quality to it. So I'm comfortable with Chiron. It has a very big part to play in the story of humanity. But if you remember back at the beginning of this video, and I was talking about where you need to be to watch this eclipse, to see it at its maximum effect, that beautiful ring of fire, and you need to be on Easter Island. That's going to give you a perfect view. And Easter Island, Rapa Nui, and the Rapa Nui people have a part to play in this solar eclipse, because guess what? The chief god, if you like, the god of fertility of the Easter Island people is Maka Maka. And Maka Maka is a celestial or a planetary dwarf, recently discovered. There have been 3, Humea, Eris, and now we have Maka Maka. And they are sort of, they're not as big as Pluto. And Pluto, of course, got demoted to a planetary dwarf, which I'm sorry, not happy with. But when we look at these other planets that are also planetary dwarfs, they've all been discovered in the 21st century. And so we're just learning about them. And if we come to Maka Maka, which is really, really interesting, you know, Easter Island is famous really for the statues, the big heads gazing out to sea, but also gazing into the interior of the island. A great mystery as to why the Rapa Nui people decided to build them or create them. They're called a moai, I think, from memory. I can't be 100% sure, but they are so strange and eerie. And of course, those moai looking out are going to be looking at the eclipse, and we know that this is the best place to see it. The symbolism is very, very important. And you know, symbolism is important in astrology. Synchronicity is important in astrology. And even if I don't want to go on thinking about Makka in terms of what it means in our charts, I am impressed enough to say, you know what, I'm going to take this into consideration. So let's look at the mythology, so to speak, of this particular planetary dwarf. And I said a moment ago, it's the god of fertility. But there's a little story. The history of Easter Island is very interesting because the population was literally virtually completely wiped out. I mean, it went from being a very fertile island, lots of palm trees, lots of things that were life sustaining, to them being completely wiped out. Now, originally, it was thought that it was the deforestation by the Rapa Nui people that caused this. But there have been recent studies which say, no, it wasn't that. It was the colony of rats, millions of rats on the island that gnawed away at the palm trees. And it was the rats that brought down the Rapa Nui people. But there's another theory as well, which is when the Europeans discovered this island, they brought with them slavery, and they also brought with them diseases. So it was a population that's completely wiped out. And I do think this tells us something about the effects of Makka in that there is something to do with the creator-destroyer principle here, where we saw how the creation was destroyed by, by nature or by man, whichever way you want to look at it. And I know some astrologers have looked at this and thought about what we're doing to the environment, what we're doing to the climate. And so that might be in there too. But I prefer the idea of the destructive elements. And also in research, when, for instance, 9/11, the sun on the day of 9/11 was conjunct Makka. And of course, the devastation that caused and the ensuing war on terror. It's interesting. I'm saying just look at it. Is this solar eclipse in conjunction with Makka going to preside over another kind of really important mass devastation? And let's see that play out without getting all up in arms about it, so much as thinking, I'm an astrological sleuth and I want to see whether any of these interpretations actually is valid. So let's look at it that way. Speaking of the past, the idea that something from the past is revealed when we're looking at a solar eclipse, and something being concealed from us at the time of the events that are taking place. That theme is playing long and loud with the solar eclipse. I want to go back to this time last year. So we're looking at October the 14th, 2023, when there was a solar eclipse in Libra again. And when we think just days beforehand, Hamas attacked Israel, massacring all those people and taking them hostage. And of course, that began the war in Gaza, which is where we are today. And this is why I'm suggesting that the solar eclipse, and I've already pointed out the connections it makes with Hezbollah's chart, Iran's chart, Israel's chart, that we've got a feeling that things are really going to really escalate at this point. It's hard to imagine how it can be stopped. I mean, we'd like to think that the idea of the fight for justice that Libra personifies, getting the balance right, will result in peace. That's what we want. But it's not looking like that. That would be cloud cuckoo land right now. And I think we're going to be looking at an intensification, even if ultimately that is what leads to peace and some kind of better situation in the whole of the Middle East. But what I also want to remind you of at this time last year, and I've got a couple of videos on that if you want to go back and look at them. This particular lunar eclipse of the 14th of October 2023 fell exactly in square to Catherine, Princess of Wales, her sun-moon opposition, and she was born on an eclipse. So we have another eclipse intersecting a lunar eclipse, a natal lunar eclipse. It took until January before it was revealed, not only she had a very serious operation, but also that cancer had been discovered. And of course, the whole of this year, we've been without her, really. She's only just recently made a comeback. And within days of that announcement, we had King Charles giving us a similar announcement, still going through chemotherapy. Catherine has finished hers. The king is still going through his. And this news broke in January. And if we go back to, I haven't said it on this particular video, but I've said it on others, that the timeline of an eclipse is much longer. When we think about this particular eclipse being 7 minutes, 40 seconds, or whatever it is long, it's a really long timeline. Then, we perhaps are looking into the spring of next year before some of the portents of this eclipse will be completely fulfilled. So what I'm saying is that I think with this solar eclipse falling on King Charles' IC, that is the opposite point to the midheaven. His IC is at 13 degrees of Libra. He has Neptune very close to that degree as well. We know that there's something fundamental going on in his life to do with the family, to do with his heritage, really. And what is his heritage? It is to be king. So the possibilities of this second solar eclipse, connecting with King Charles's chart, is to suggest that within a short period of time, maybe as long as the spring of next year, there will be announcements as to the future of the monarchy. Now, there are all sorts of possibilities here. We can already see that Prince William is taking on many, many more duties, that William and Catherine are much more front forward when it comes to everything concerning the royal family, which is as it should be, because no one knows when the king will die and they will be king and queen. But what we're certainly looking at is a situation right now where the king is looking very fragile. He may be as strong as an ox, but he's looking fragile. We've got this solar eclipse on his IC. I must believe that there are discussions going on at this time about the best way forward for the royal family, for the monarchy, and would that best way forward be with Charles definitely taking a back seat and handing over the reins of the monarchy to William earlier than expected, before he dies. So this is a very unusual situation, but I think we're living in unusual times. And we already had in January of this year the abdication of the Queen of Denmark in favor of her son, and that's the first time that had happened. So I think the solar eclipse might have a lot to do with that as well. But as I said, don't necessarily expect it on October the 2nd, but remember it, because that's the sort of thing that we would be looking at, the significance of an eclipse playing its role in history. So I think my conclusion, and what made me, well, the things that I've been talking about, and I thought, I want to talk a little bit more about this, and that is the Mars principle. And Mars is anger, action, courage, conflict, desire. It's things that in the 20th century, and the age of sophistication, you might say, that we feel it's bad to express our anger. It's a kind of quality we kind of want to try to suppress. We want to be civilized. But just because we want to be civilized doesn't mean that Mars has left the solar system. That function is just as important as Venus for love. And they are opposite functions, aren't they? War, peace. Second time we've referred to these opposite functions. And it's a way I want to think about Mars. Without Mars, we would not have goals. We would not find the fire in the belly that we need when we must go after something. Without Mars, we wouldn't have the courage to go for things that are a little out of reach, or to stand up to bullies, or to stand up for what we believe in. People have to go to war to protect their country, and we can see that going on everywhere right now. And so the Mars function is something we need to embrace more. I mean, within ourselves. I mean, if we don't embrace something that's there, it goes underground. And if you don't use your Mars function, then it's either going to come out in the way of rashes or some kind of hives. You've got the idea that that Mars fiery energy is going to come out. So it can lead to all sorts of fevers and breakdowns in our health and mental well-being. And also, if we suppress Mars in ourselves, then it pops up out in front of us. So we're always coming into contact with people who want to shout and scream at us and push us around and bully us. And we find ourselves in situations of conflict. So it is important to embrace Mars for its energy, if you like. And the thing about anger is that it isn't a positive energy if it's positively directed. And I think that's what I want us to think about at this time, is the idea of embrace our anger. It can be healthy. It can get us places. It needs to be embraced. But the important thing is to direct it where it's meant to be, so that we don't, set fire to the whole forest. We just do it very specifically. And I guess that is what I really wanted to talk about. It's come up a couple of times, and I think I spoke about Mars in Cancer in my last video, and now this one. And I think it's worth thinking about, because that's the wonderful thing about astrology. When we look at these planets in the horoscopic circle, they are a part of life. They are our life story. And every single one of them has a function. And by embracing it and recognizing it, we lead healthy lives. It's when we fear something or we block it and suppress it, we become ill. And maybe we also need to look at that on a wider front in terms of humanity as well. So a lot to think about. Thank you for being with me, and I look forward to seeing you next time, when we'll be talking about the full moon in Aries. Bye for now.